Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the bi-weekly Cluster API vSphere provider syncup. Today is October 8th, and I hope everybody has a link to the meeting notes. I'll go ahead and share my screen with the web page, and then we can just talk about the topics on there. Okay. So the first thing, can everybody just add their attendee? And if you're with a different company outside of VMware, if you can go ahead and indicate what company you're with. Does everybody have a link to this? I can send that to you guys if you don't. Here, let me copy this and then paste it in the chat.
I already shared in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
I do not have permissions to write onto it.
Let me. I might have not given Hui the version that allows you to edit. Let me see if this is the same one. It's the same. Anybody should be able to write, edit this, but let me.
I'm not able to edit either.
Okay. This is the one that Google gives me. That's weird. It's the same URL. I don't understand.
It looks like it's possible to modify it now with that change.
Okay. Okay, so while everybody's adding their attendee information, let's go ahead and get started. So I've listed a couple of items on the agenda. So Darth, I know that you have a couple of other items you want to talk about or that you want to share with the team. If you can, just go ahead and add that to the agenda. And if anybody else has any agenda that they would like to discuss, go ahead and add it to the agenda. So the first part of the agenda that I wanted to talk about was that, we have a KubeCon presentation for the Cluster API. VMware and Heptio will be doing a joint presentation. So it was accepted about 2 weeks ago, and right now we're currently planning on figuring out what we're going to show from the VMware side. And I believe the title of the talk is something like using the Cluster API to deploy both on-prem and in the cloud. I will be presenting with Chris Nova from Heptio. So there's that. The second thing is where we are currently converging on the idea of trying to get an OVA design that's open, that's going to be in the open source repo for KubeCon. So initially I thought that the goal for KubeCon should be that we should get the vSphere provider stay up to date with the main repo, get it in testing, and get the Govimami provisioner, the variant in. But now we're trying to push for an OVA. So there's that. Any question or comments about that?
Can you clarify what you mean by OVA design for the vSphere provider, like a base image?
So right now, today, if you use the cluster control, it will try to create a bootstrap VM with Minikube, and then create the target cluster, and then do the pivot back to the target cluster, then delete the bootstrap cluster. But if multiple people did that in like your department or in your company, the information on that cluster is gone. I mean, it's on that person's machine or up in the target cluster, but the administrator has no central record of it, other than going to the vSphere console. So we discussed a couple of months back creating an OVA that has the bootstrap cluster. So the OVA would deploy with an initial cluster, and when you use cluster control, you would target the cluster that's in the OVA. So that so instead of creating a bootstrap, you would not have to do that. By doing that, if multiple people were using cluster control to create a cluster using this existing OVA, then all that information is kept on in one location. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But well, I think if we like want to support this use case, we probably should discuss that within the main cluster API to like keep the original cluster, because right now the assumption is that this pivoting does happen, and in the end everything is like in the target cluster.
Well, it has been discussed through several meetings. Other companies within Cluster API are implementing their solution in this way. So the fact that we have the option to do using an existing cluster and also the ability to not do the pivot, that's been discussed before, but when it comes close, when we get closer to finishing up this work, we'll announce it at the Cluster API, the main Cluster API meeting. Do you have any other comments or questions?
No, thanks.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Alvo, okay, I see. You're at the same company as Marco. Okay, I was just curious about that. So the next thing I want to announce is that we now have more people from VMware joining the effort. Within my team, we now have 3 additional people joining, possibly 4. And what we're intending to do is get this into CI/CD, the vSphere provider, and start building tests with vCSIM, and also build the OVA. So we have about 5 weeks to build this and get it ready for KubeCon. So it's going to be a busy 5 weeks for 5 of us who are currently working on the Cluster API vSphere provider. The next, okay, moving on. Siddharth got a PR merged in, and this contains the Govimami actuator. So I wanted to bring up the question, should we keep the Terraform actuator around? The original reason why we wanted to keep the Terraform actuator around was that, so once we we put this into CI and get more tests written for this. We were going to use the Terraform provider to benchmark the Govimami provider against. However, the Terraform provider was basically a prototype that Google did, and they have given up any ownership of it, and they do not intend to do any more updates to it. VMware, at least the people who are currently working on this project, have no intention to maintain it, fix bugs in it, or extend it. So I started questioning what is the value of keeping the Terraform actuator around if we're not going to maintain it. And it may not be a good benchmark to test the Govimami actuator on. So does anybody have an opinion on this? For or against?
I think we should, so this is that, so I think we should probably keep it maybe for a little while, if not too long. I think so Govimami code just got merged, and I think, I know right now we do not have an end-to-end CI which kind of tests the cluster API altogether. Maybe we can wait until we can get a end-to-end test running successfully with Govimami. And this is more just to keep the Terraform as a reference point. That's basically my intention. Not essentially in the way to say we'll end up using Terraform again, but more about, given that that was the initial implementation and that seems to work to some extent, just till the time we are satisfied with that the Govimami implementation is completely covering everything that it does from the Terraform side, we can just keep that code around just for reference sake. And once we have passed that, then we can, of course, just clean it out and remove it. That would be my take.
Okay, so I have two comments on that. There were some functionality in the Terraform provider that were broken, specifically the delete code. And I did some debugging of it, but I never finished figuring out how to fix it. The second thing I want to mention is that with the CRD migration, I wonder if the Terraform provider will now be broken. That it may no longer be useful. It may, maybe even create doesn't work. And if we keep that around, we'll have to fix it. In which case, does that really provide us a benchmark anymore?
Right. I mean, so one thing is, like, between the two implementation that we have today, the Govimami and the Terraform, the way one would switch between the two is literally in the code. You have to uncomment one line and comment the other. So given that it's not like a config driven thing that somebody could just say, in my input YAML, I can decide whether to do with Terraform or Govimami. At least it's not modeled that way at the moment. Given that that is the case, maintaining the Terraform, I'm not sure if there's, because people will not be able to try out Terraform to begin with even, until really they go and modify the code and then build on their own and then try it out, number one. Secondly, as far as the actuator, I think the actuator interface is still exactly the same between once the cluster API moved to CRD. So I think the actuator interface should continue to work. However, things that may get broken now after the migration to the like the CRDs would be things like the cluster CTL binary, the cluster CTL code, client-side code that we have in our repository, that may or may not completely function with with the cluster API code, which is based on CRDs now. So that might need some work.
Okay. Does anybody else have any comment on it? I'm fine with keeping it there for the time being until we decide that it's no longer useful.
So one question about.
Go ahead. Brian.
Yeah, so there is no way that you can specify which provider you want to use, Terraform versus Govimami, right? It's just one of them.
Right now, there is no way, but so this falls under the the topic of something that we've been discussing in Cluster API for the last 2 months, which is the concept of a variant. So a variant is it's exactly the same thing, right? So you have one variant of an provisioner, and then you have another variant of a provisioner. And the idea initially was that there are people in the community right now building let's say the AWS cluster API provider, and let's say that Amazon decides to create their own. So that now you have 2 different variants, and we need a way to indicate one versus the other. So this would fall under the topic of variants. Right now, the cluster control CLI does not have the ability to switch between variants, and this is something that we're going to need to add to it. But as far as the last time I checked, we were still debating on the name of what to call this and not, and we didn't decide how all the details about, how do you indicate which variant to use, and how do you tag the cluster as saying that this was created with this variant yet. So, I thought about it today. I thought, well, I could add an issue to the main repo to add a CLI option. However, I think it's a little bit more than that, right? We can put in an option for the CLI, but how will we know which variant the cluster was created with? And until we decide what is the way that we should do that, I don't really want to add that option right now.
Okay. So my question was not about having that ability. It was more about, okay, so it's right now it's just Go vMommy. So yes. I'm assuming, as basically what it was been talking here, is that the Terraform code is just there for some, for some reference of how it used to work, but we don't plan to use that anymore.
Well, we can use it. We just comment out the lines, rebuild it, and then it's a long process. But we can. I think that's what Siddharth is referring to, is that we keep the code around, and if something doesn't work with the Go vMommy, we can just comment out the line and rebuild and try it out with the Terraform provided attribute.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is just to keep that around for a little while, hopefully not for long, but just for a little while, just to settle things out. And pretty much that's about it. I mean, once we have, tested out most of the general use cases with Cluster API with the Go vMommy implementation, and if all of that works, then at that point in time, we can simply say, let's put out a PR, just clean out the code for Terraform and just remove it all together. And we don't necessarily need that anymore. And that would be the story about it.
Okay.
Any other comments on this topic? Okay, so why don't we move on to the next topic? One of the big things that was occurring in the main repo for the last month or so was this: we were migrating the current API, the current cluster API repo, to migrating it to CRD, and we knew that when that would happen, that it would have ripple effects to the individual vendor providers. Today I noticed that we updated the dependency and pulled in the CRD migration code. This could have potentially broken the cluster API provider for vSphere. I'm currently investigating that right now, but we were going to have to take this work on eventually. It would have been nice if we could have done for something like this. This was a pretty big change. For something like this, we probably would have held off on merging a depth update, but it's done. It's done with. So we have.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. I'm actually confused because the vSphere provider does not contain a cluster API version with that change. I just clicked on that.
Did the CRD so it was my understanding from the last couple of meetings that there might be changes that occurs in the vSphere in all the vendor provider code if we pull in the latest code from the main repo. And Google said that they would come up with a best practices on how to update the vendor-specific provider repos. So right now, we don't know what whether if it's broken or not. We just don't know. So I think right now all we have to do is just to go about testing it and making sure it's. If it still works and there's no impact, then great. But we just simply don't know at this point.
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents around this is, as you said, right, we can test out and see if it is working or not, number one. If at all, let's say if it is, my understanding is that since the actuator interface hasn't changed, so the core code of the implementation should just work. But my suspicion is that the cluster CTL command, the CLI, that might have gotten impacted because of this change. So it may have been in a case now that it might not work. But if we decide that if we detect that that is not working, one of the other options we can do is we can in the dependency, we can pin down the dependency instead of going on the master branch for cluster API. So I think Robert Bailey from Google, when he did merge the cluster CRD or the CRD based change, he did cut out a branch before that. So we can actually use that git tag at the moment to kind of pin down to that version of cluster API in case if we see that the cluster CTL command is broken at the moment or things are not working at the moment. And we can then take our time to investigate and maybe look at if the upstream community comes up with the best practices to say how the provider code should get updated, and then we can follow that and then move it. I mean, there are a couple of those choices, I think.
Yeah.
For us.
So I think the first thing I want to do is just to test it out, test out whether it's still working or not. And then once we have that, if we find out it's broken, then we can go to that tag.
But we need to migrate to a CRD anyway, right?
Say that again, Troy?
So we need to migrate to a KubeBuilder and CRDs anyway, right?
Yeah, but that's done in the main repo. We don't. I'm not really sure where we have to do. The provider repo, we mainly have to implement the actuator interfaces, and I'm not exactly sure what the CRD migration, how that affects.
Now, I'm asking that because I have seen for the Google provider, they have done some modifications. I have seen that for the AWS one, they are planning to do that as well. So I'm assuming that some work needs to be done. I don't know exactly what type of work needs to be done.
Yes, that's correct. So as part of this merge that they did in the main repo for cluster API, I think Google also merged at the same time the modifications to the GCP provider alongside hand in hand with this main change to make it as a reference implementation. So yes, you're right. There's probably some changes for sure that we need to make. We probably just need to either look at the GCP implementation to see what did they change and what were the things that we have to adapt to, or we can potentially maybe wait, because I'm hoping that upstream community, they're going to come out with some sort of a guideline to say, okay, this is how things that you have to migrate or things how you have to move around to use the new CRD based system.
Okay. So that's what I'm going to do the rest of the day. I'm going to investigate what this change will, how this change affects us, and then I'll have a better understanding of whether we can make the changes quickly or whether we can just. I don't know if you can back out a merge PR in on GitHub, or we can just do another PR that pulls in the tagged version of the main repo prior to the CRD change.
Yeah, I think the second one is what is we're going to do. We probably just change the Go. What is this file? The Go package.toml file. In that, we can just say, instead of master, switch to that particular one and then do the dep ensure update again. And then it should potentially get to the right version, I think.
We are awesome that way.
Okay. So this is all the topics I have to discuss today. Siddharth, you have some topics that you wanted to talk about that you described earlier today. Do you want to talk about that here, or do you want?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so there's so
can you just
let me give me 1 second. I'm just going to pull up that. So these are like some of the additional issues that we had open earlier on the vSphere provider side, the cluster API provider side, and these are mainly things like enhancements. Some of them are enhancements, some of them are fixes, but most of them are more features than enhancements. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was supporting like multiple networks, because that's something that is one of the things that kind of, for the purpose of my use of the cluster API, I kind of need that. So I was hoping we can see if everybody is okay with that. And let me just have a reference here.
Do I need to stop sharing and then you want to share?
I mean, you can probably just go to that link. It's the link that I just pasted. That's just because it's the same. Yeah, it's a very simple. So like add multiple NIC support to the node machines. So today it's only one NIC with Terraform. Well, now with GoBeMami. But the idea is that we want to make the description flexible. So these are like some of the additional higher level things. So the way we get to this is basically the crux of my proposal, which I'm thinking is like the way we have today our description of how we define our machines. Actually, you know what? Let me share my screen. Maybe that might be simpler because I can then show a simple example.
Let me stop sharing.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead.
Let me get the right file. Just 1 second.
So if I understand this correctly, so the way the CX would work would be, they had one target or 5 or 3 sites.
Just arranging some windows here.
I'm consolidating, or we're using DR here, so
I can hear some background noise also. Some people speaking.
Yeah.
If no one is talking, can you just self except for Siddharth?
Okay. Do you see my screen? Do you guys see my screen? Hey, Log, do you see my screen?
I do.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay.
The fonts may be a little small.
Okay, let me move to the fonts.
Siddharth, are you sitting at your cube right now?
Yes, actually I am. So
okay,
sorry.
So the sound that you guys are hearing are people.
Probably, yeah. My neighbor. Okay, so today, what I want to say is, this is like a sample YAML file of how we describe our machine today, and this part here is mainly where like we define what properties drive that particular instance. And today, in our definition, this machine variable is a simple key value pair, like a map. It's a string map of these are the keys and the values. And today, Terraform and GoBeMami both were just reading based on the specific keys. Now, this structure was probably okay to begin with, but this is kind of inflexible in terms of when you want to express things like, okay, I want to have multiple NICs, because there's no simple way of just expanding this key value pair to incorporate that in a flexible way. So what I'm actually kind of thinking about is adding something like this, add one more defined object. So we can probably keep the machine variables as is for the time being, and we can phase it out, but define something like, let's say, a machine spec. And this could be like a more structured information about the machine. So what I have is pretty much the same information like data center, data store, resource pool. Then in network here, for example, could be a list of networks. And within each network, you could give the network name and what sort of IP configuration do you want, whether you want DHCP or static IP, for example, for that NIC, that you could elaborate in this list here, and that would be returned into the instances. Then again, number of CPUs, the same thing with the disks. So instead of just having one disk label, you have a list of disk label and size property. So these are again coming, since we are creating it from a template today. So these disks, I'm imagining what would happen is whatever the labels and size you give, we'll try and match the disks that are detected in that template, and then accordingly resize the instance when we create it. So again, so this is just the basic of like how we can potentially define the instance or the VM that we want to create for the node, which kind of leads us to the flexibility where we can support multiple NICs, we can support multiple type of networks, we can support various disks if you want to. So I don't know. So that was just my, the way that I was kind of going with. And if you guys have any input on whether this is a good idea, bad idea, maybe something we can do better, or I'm open to suggestions.
So Dorothy, you should mention the part about the cloud in it.
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. So one of the things that I was actually trying to look at over the weekend was to how we can configure the networking. So this is one of the topics that I actually brought up on the Cluster API Slack channel as well. So the basic part is today the Cluster API and all the provider implementation, they assume that the instances will get the IP provided by their corresponding cloud provider. So whether it is AWS, GCE, vSphere, or any other, the IP of the VM will automatically come magically out from that provider, which is basically saying it's a DHCP IP. For the vSphere side, I mean, essentially, I think there is a reasonable case that one can make that for a production quality cluster, if you are creating, you might want to control those IP as well. So when you're creating, so that means that when you're defining your cluster in the cluster API mechanism, you want to define this is the specific IP, network, netmask, gateway, DNS for that IP. Now, today, the mechanism how we kind of get this information inside that instance is via Cloud Init. And if you look at the current implementation that we have, we are using the Ubuntu cloud image. And one of the property that we are at least utilizing at the moment is in the OVA version that is provided by the Ubuntu. They have exposed user data as a base64 encoded property in the OVF properties. So you could inject user data in the way Cloud Init expects, and base64 encode, and you push it down in the OVF properties, and then that would just work fine. And that is precisely what we are using today. Now the tricky part is the IP configuration that you cannot push using user data. I mean, Cloud Init at least states that user data should not be used for pushing network. The proper place for that is provided by the metadata, the similar bucket, just like user data, there is a metadata that needs to be used to push networking information into the VM. And I think at the moment, the Ubuntu cloud image that is available, that we are using upstream, it doesn't have that base64 encoded way of providing the metadata, which basically kind of becomes a problem, because now if you want to inject a static IP, we can't really get in. Now, a solution to this problem essentially is, so one of our fellow members in VMware here, Andrew, he wrote a data source for, let me actually see if I can, this one, yeah. So Andrew Kurtz, I mean, he wrote a Cloud Init for VMware guest information based on the VMware guest info here. And the way it works is very simple. You enable one additional data source. So this is, you install it on the alongside with Cloud Init, and it registers itself as an additional data source inside the guest. So when Cloud Init runs, just like it knows how to read like ISOs and metadata proxy and all of that, it knows now one more thing to read, which is the vSphere VMX properties. And the way you pass the information to this Cloud Init is via these properties that you can set in the extra config of the VM that you create. And as you can see here, it has placeholders for metadata, user data, and vendor data. So pretty much you're kind of covered from all bases when it comes to passing any sort of information that you want to drive your VM with. So one of the things is, I mean, it would have been nice if this additional data source for Cloud Init was already part of the Cloud Init and it was by default available, then we could have just used this. But since that is not the case, I think right now, the only solution that comes to my mind is we have to create a custom image, like a custom, let's say a custom Ubuntu image with Cloud Init in it, alongside with this data source installed. And use that to basically bootstrap the entire process. I don't know. So this is what I at least have narrowed down. If anybody has a different opinion or a different way of doing it.
So does everybody understand what Siddharth just explained? If not, I can ask a couple of questions, pointed questions, and I'm hoping it will make it clear for everybody.
I have a questions for Siddharth, plus I might be doing the same thing as what Luke, you mentioned. Maybe I'm asking a pointed question here too, which is probably will help clear it out. When you say this added data source for guest info, could you clarify more on what this data source is doing? And I know it's adding those ability to process those fields, but is it a plugin into open VM tools, or how does it work?
Sure. Okay. So first of all, this is an additional. This is like so Cloud Init itself provides a mechanism to really anybody would come in and write their own data source if they want to. So this is like a reference implementation of that extensibility into Cloud Init. Now the way it is implemented, it is today is using the VMware guest tools inside the instance to actually query these guest information properties. That's the underlying implementation part. And actually the code is literally right in here. So this file, you can, if you just go through and you will be able to see some calls to, run certain things here.
Okay.
So that's like just the basic of what that is. Now, how, it is, so the question is like how it is installed. I mean, it has to be pre-installed in that image alongside with Cloud Init, so that then when the instance actually boots, it can actually query and use this data source as well.
Okay.
Okay.
So let me try to summarize it, and you tell me if I'm correct or not. Okay. Just the workflow. So now what we're going to do, what you intend to do is you have this inside of the YAML, and when we provision the VMs, you're going to take this information, you're going to write it into the guest info, the VMX file, and and this image needs to be built with a Cloud Init image that has this data source inside of it. And when you start up this VM, this data source will then read that information and then set the values you want. Is that correct?
So we had to do
yes, that is correct.
So because you need this extra data source in the VM, you cannot use the off-the-shelf Cloud Init image that you find on, like for instance, Ubuntu website. You need a custom image that has this Python script inside of it. Right?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so that sounds pretty reasonable to me. My previous project, vSphere Integrated Containers, we did something very similar, and it works fine. The The only problem with putting it into the extra config, though, is that if you want to update the VM in any way, that requires a reconfig. So I know on Vic we were talking about moving all that information to something like config DB. Or was it names? I think it's a config DB. But yeah, for the we probably don't need that. I think this to me this method sounds pretty reasonable.
Right. I mean, no, but you bring in a good point essentially, because it helps in the day zero to initially bootstrap that VM with whatever information. But what about if on a day 2, day 3, day 10, if you want to modify something, how does that workflow look like? So one is since this particular information here is completely tied to CloudInit. So one thing with CloudInit means you have to reboot the VM because CloudInit only gets activated when the machine boots, period, right? So therefore, pretty much the information that we're going to pass in this block here has to be consumed completely at the boot time. I mean, we cannot pass anything which is going to be subsequently used later on. So we should basically try to make sure that whatever things we are setting in here are appropriately, broken down for specific use, I guess.
Yeah.
And things like so I said, right? I mean, the main motivation here being like how we can push down a static IP, which is where it all started, right? So, I think once we have a static IP that we have pushed down a VM, I'm not very sure if you really want to go and change it. And I think I could see a point that if you do want to change an IP, I would rather say, let's create a brand new VM with that desired new IP and then just phase this one out as a replacement. Instead of modifying this, because then you might run into issues with certs and a bunch of other problems.
Okay, so I mentioned config DB. That support, at least I don't think it has yet. I don't think that govimami has support for config DB yet, and that is
Siddharth, this is Dhaval here. I've tried a different technique of avoiding a step of the data source that you have done. If after the meeting we could sync up, I could probably discuss and maybe we can present it next time.
Sure.
I've already tried something that avoids having to repurpose the image. I've seen another mechanism where I could do this, so we could discuss this offline.
Okay.
Well, if you have an idea, just go ahead and say it out here.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say that right now. So I'll talk to Siddharth.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Sure. Thanks, Dhaval. I'll touch base with you.
Thanks, Siddharth.
Okay, Siddharth, could you relinquish and then let me grab the screen again?
Hey, Siddharth, can I confirm here? So the topic you're discussing here, like by setting static IP, is something that will be implemented, right? It's not something already there. Oh.
Yes, no. So the static IP, so at least the current cluster API implementation across different providers, none of them have even the remote concept of a static IP. I think we're probably going to be the first provider who are going to talk about this concept of static IP. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, right, as I brought it up on the Slack channel like a couple of days back, one of the other use cases that at least people refer to that might be useful, which might actually also use static IP, is if they were to do like a bare metal provisioning. I mean, I know that's not there at the moment by any stretch of imagination, but I mean, that's like a future-looking thing that they at least think that, static having the construct of defining and providing static IPs might be useful in that context as well.
No, as a guy who has maintained a cluster in the past, I think having a static IP for your cluster is, at least for your masters, is important. So having this kind of setup is very useful. I think it's a very good feature.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely very useful for us for vSphere side, but because I do not know, for example, if you get a VM in AWS, say, I don't know what are the guarantees of the IP. I mean, do they ever change or are they guaranteed to be there forever? I'm not sure. So maybe that's the thing, right? That the upstream community, especially looking at these cloud providers, they may not really realize that, effectively the underlying provider might actually be doing a static IP for all we care, but that's kind of transparent.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so another question, the follow-up question is, so because I'm new to Cluster API, so I don't have many context. So you're talking about rely on the instance or the VM image that we customize the VM image to cloud for this data source. How Cluster API manage the VM templates today? Is it out of scope, or it is part of the scope?
So we can talk about that tomorrow when we have the onboarding meeting.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm hoping I'll be able to answer all those questions tomorrow and show you guys.
I mean, just to give a one-liner answer to that, I mean, there is no template management, but when you define the VM, in that there is just like where I showed, like you have the data store and all of that, in the same field, you have one property called template, where you give in the pass which template do you want to call. That's about it.
Okay, got you. Yeah, actually, then I got it. So thanks.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other topics that they want to discuss or they have questions about?
Yeah, I do want to bring up, so it looks like we actually need the CI or need some testing running to make sure, like the CRD change, we are not sure whether that's going to break our implementation. So have we discussed the timeline, like when we will have this CI?
You mean the CLI? I don't know. I think right now the first thing to do is to test it, and that's what I'm going through right now, is to test it to see if it still works. Given what Farhan has said and what Robert Bailey had said about the Google provider in the last couple of meetings, that there should be some changes that we will have to make. I don't know what they are. And I don't really know what the impact is yet. But yeah, I'm hoping by tomorrow, I will have, at least if there are things that we need to do to update the provider, I'll have issues written up on GitHub.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Actually, the question is not about the CRD change itself. I'm saying regarding the CI/CD, have we discussed about the timeline, when the CI job is going to be set up? It's going to be very soon, so that we can kind of guard any potential big change.
Well, I think that's going to be up to us to figure that out, right? I mean, I know that you and I are going to have a big role to play in that.
Yes, I just not sure whether we have discussed this timeline already. So, so it's just throw a question here.
I would say as soon as possible, but I mean, given that we have you referring to being able to detect issues like the CRD change, right?
Yes.
Right now, I mean, I don't think we need to put any more extra pressure on the CI/CD task. I mean, as soon as possible, I think. Do you have any other comments? Anything else?
No, I think that's a fair answer. I just want to know whether they're already committed timeline, so we have to work toward that, or we actually need to discuss and because you and me going to discuss this soon and basically maybe define a timeline.
Okay. Yeah, so why don't we discuss that offline, and then once we have a plan, we can present it to this meeting in 2 weeks.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. So one other thing I will mention is that the SIG VMware, I don't know if everybody goes to that, but they've asked for us to put together a demo of the cluster API. And as part of the investigation of the CRD impact, I will try to record a demo that then in 2 weeks I can show that demo to this meeting, but I'll likely show that video at this week's SIG VMware meeting. Okay. If there are no other questions or comment, I think we can call this meeting finished. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Luke.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Luke. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.